Mike has been a long-time partner with RCAF USA. He's an independent cattle producer, business entrepreneur, and political activist. He serves as an outspoken, this is an understatement, he serves as an outspoken leader in addressing the rural, social, and cultural impact of current economic trends. He's a native of Evergreen, Colorado, earned his bachelor's degree from Colorado State University, later moved to St. Francis, Kansas, where he started farming and ranching. He and a small group of investors built a cattle feeding operation in '78. In '86, he left that operation and built his own independent 12,000 head feed yard nearby. He invented the Callicrate Smart Bander from the booth right here in the corner. In 2000, he formed a value-added meat company called Ranch Foods Direct. And since the mid-90s, Mike has been actively involved in social and political efforts to improve the welfare of family farms and to restore effective publicly regulated markets. He was a founding member of several farm advocacy groups, including RCAF USA, and a lead plaintiff in the class action lawsuit against the world's largest meat packer, IBP, now known as Tyson Foods. And in that case, alleging unfair and discriminatory marketing practices. So with that, Mike, welcome. And we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thank you, Bill. I want to talk a little bit about some history. Why RCAF? And while we're pulling up the slides there, I think one of the reasons why RCAF is NCBA. I recall those years, those early years, well, actually prior to RCAF, going to the NCBA meetings. And of course, we were there when NCA became NCBA, when they merged with the checkoff, opposing that. But then we gave it a chance, and we went to some NCBA conventions. And I just never forget Dr. Max, how articulate he was, and how effective I think he was. And we actually got some policy, you know, with Leo McDonald, you know, Herman Schumacher, Johnny Smith, a bunch of groups, a bunch of folks from Oregon came, and we got what the policy we wanted that winter. But by the summer NCBA meeting, they had reversed it all. Really, what we did is we woke them up, and then we got nowhere. So then, you know, it was time to do something different. We decided, and so if you go back to where, you know, I really figured out there was an issue. It was this person right here, Kathleen Kelly. I was fussed up over what the packers were doing to cattle feeders. I knew they were cooperating. I knew they were delegating territory. You know, I had a show list every Monday morning that I posted, and I had as many as 20 meat packers I could sell to. They didn't all show up every week, but I could call them, I could sell to them, and a lot of them did show up. But then they started dying off, you know, and we knew why. I mean, IBP, the big meat packers, they basically forced them out of business. So I was really, really worrying a lot about concentration. And so there was one day in my office, a animal health supplier came by the name of Clint Jelm, and he drops this concentration report on my desk. He says, "Mike, you got to read this." I says, "Where'd you get that?" He says, "My father-in-law got it. He was in Meeker at a coffee shop, and a guy gave it to him, Meeker, Colorado." And so here it was. I read it, and I was just totally blown away with this report. It explained everything that was basically wrong with the cattle business. And here I am, you know, in the cattle business, had dedicated my life, invested everything I had, and I was just, you know, I just felt like we were all being played for fools with the big meat packers and the way they were treating us. And so that's what really got me going with Kathleen. And as a result of that, I called Kathleen, and she says, what are you doing with that report? She said, "That has not even been released yet. I gave it to my dad to have it edited. I didn't mean for him to share it," which he shared it. And of course, then I cranked up my fax machine. And of course, you know, I had like 300 people on a fax list. But that got Kathleen and I, all of that work we were doing at the time, got Kathleen and I invited to the governor's conference in South Dakota, Governor Janklow. And here's just a quote from Kathleen during her part of the presentation, which was a day-long conference in Pierre. And she said, "There is no question more critical to cattle producers today than whether or not their price is affected by packer concentration." This guy was also at the governor's conference. Bob Peterson, CEO of IBP. There is no stopping it. Concentration. This is an evolution that's going to take place in spite of whoever is in the way. And this is a quote taken from the 1996 Meat and Poultry magazine. So Bob's pretty confident. You know, he's and had every right to be. I mean, actually, he was 100% right. But here we are with, you know, a bunch of us starting to gather and compare notes and starting to work together. And Staten Weldon writes an article for the West Texas Weekly, and all of a sudden you see a letter from Sam Britt, and you start seeing people starting to coalesce. And Leo's talking about trade, and that's absolutely feeding into this problem of concentration and sourcing outside of the marketplace and importing livestock to reduce prices paid to cattle producers. And so this is all very important stuff. And by the end of the conference, Bob Peterson at the very end in the panel part of the conference, I was on one end of the table and Bob Peterson was on the other. And Johnny Smith asked the question about Peterson. Peterson had said they do not import livestock. They do not import. He said, we do not import. And so Johnny Smith got up and he says, well, Bob, what are those trucks that are running up and down? Is it Interstate 29? Is that the one? And Bob says, oh, well, those are not imports. And I leaned forward and looked down the table at Bob and I said, hey, Bob, those are imports. And he just blew up. I mean, terrible things came out of his mouth. Bruce Bass was sitting right down here on the front row, the head buyer for IBP. And he's going like this. And Bob Peterson never spoke in public, at least not in front of a mixed group. He never spoke in public again after that. He showed the personality of IBP. Mean, angry, retaliatory, and you know, it was worth learning. So we did put a lot of pressure on. We gathered, we decided that, you know, thanks to Staten really, we ended up putting a group together, and Sam Britt was friends with the attorneys, and we put this group together in Amarillo, Texas, and basically the attorneys told us about the Packers and Stockyards Act and how we really thought we could win a case if we could bring a case based on the Packers and Stockyards Act. I mean, the clear language of the act basically says you can't show preference, you can't retaliate, you can't discriminate, you can't do anything. These are the words of the Packers and Stockyards Act. You cannot do anything that even so much as affects competition. You can't do that. And so we filed the picket case. And then within a short time, we filed the case. It's moving forward, and it's now 1998, and I've got 14,000 cattle in my 12,000 head feedlot. Can't sell them. How could you have 14,000 in a 12,000 head feedlot? Well, because they kept coming in, and I wasn't getting rid of them. And so I called up Dan Glickman, and I said, Dan, and of course I knew him. I'm in Kansas. Dan's a former legislator from Kansas. I says, hey, Dan, why don't you enforce the Packers and Stockyards Act? And I wouldn't have this problem of not being able to sell my cattle. I was already down to just one packer, National Beef. No other packers would buy from me, but National, I'd been delegated, I suppose, National Beef, and they were buying my cattle with zero competition. I mean, it's a take it or leave it price. And Dan Glickman said, well, you know, Mike, in this modern day of globalization, we need big meat packers that can do business globally. That was it. That's the whole globalization thing. And we just don't fit in that model. At least we don't fit as an independent producer receiving a competitive price for what we produce. So as time passed, finally 8 years later, we end up in Montgomery, Alabama in the federal courthouse. And here's the picture of well, it was in the book too. It's in the RCAF 25-year book. But we got Van Davis, we got Sam Britt, we got Chris Abbott, Pat Goggins, Johnny Smith, Leroy Pickett, the named plaintiff in the case, Leo McDonald. My father-in-law is leading the charge into the courthouse there. My father-in-law, Swede Callan. And so we are basically in a courtroom for right out 40 days, presenting the evidence. And what was interesting is all of this evidence that we had received and able to present to the court through discovery, there was not a single USDA person, a Packers and Stockyards person, any law enforcement person in the room for the government. Why? Why weren't they there? So they could learn how anti-competitive the markets are. So they could learn what the jury had learned during the case that gave us a jury award of $1.28 billion. Why couldn't the government have been there if those bureaucrats are such honest, hardworking people in the Packers and Stockyards division? They didn't show up. But the jury awarded us $1.28 billion, but that wasn't the important thing. We honestly didn't care at all about the money. We wanted the injunctive relief. We wanted a change in the behavior of these packers. We wanted them to stop stealing our livestock. The judge reversed the jury verdict. Of course, he gave them instructions that theoretically they couldn't have really decided the case based upon. They were instructions more in line with the Sherman-Clayton Act, which this is about producers. This is the Packers and Stockyards Act, our producers being harmed. Judge Strom was a Reagan appointee from Omaha, Nebraska, and he knew the cattle business. So he had replaced our earlier judge, Judge Albritton, who didn't know the cattle business, which would have been a better judge, actually, for us, because he could have come into it unbiased. And so basically, Michael Cadiz talks about the disasters of failure. What happens when a case fails? What happens when the judge reverses the jury verdict? Not only takes that jury verdict away from us, but made us pay Tyson's court cost of almost $80,000. That's a big reversal. But that wasn't all it did. It gave the green light. It totally gave the green light to the industry to pillage and plunder all they want. And they did, absolutely did, because they knew they were never going to have to worry about any regulations or any antitrust enforcement. And so Herman Schumacher, South Dakota cattle producer, and I joined a case on boxed beef when they manipulated the prices of boxed beef. All four packers got together and manipulated the prices of boxed beef. I mean, you know the industry. We just kept going up and down and losing equity, losing everything we had from time to time. I mean, and it was just this horrible cycle. I mean, honestly, you got up every day in fear of your livelihood. Is this supposed to happen in America, that we get up every day as a hardworking, independent producer, a wealth creator, and you've got to worry every day when you get out of bed whether you're going to be in business? I lived through the 80s. Big problem in the 80s when they just took our places. They just, raised the interest rates, and if you didn't have the equity, they just took it away from you. And here we are again in the 90s, and here we are right now again today. And so anyway, we win the case. Yeah, we end up in the South Dakota court, and we win again in front of the jury. But how do you win when the appeals courts are loaded up with Reagan-appointed judges, dereg judges that don't believe in antitrust law enforcement? In the Pickett case, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they just refused to hear it, in favor of the Anna Nicole Smith Family Feud case. That did us all a lot of good to have that case figured out, right? And so anyway, the same thing in South Dakota. We win the case. We're going to hopefully get injunctive relief. We got a jury award. I can't remember how much it was, but it wasn't near like the Pickett case. But again, the case got reversed. On appeal, they reversed it. And then they attached Herman's house to pay for the attorney's fees of the bean packers. So Bill calls a meeting out there you know, where, Herman, where was your house at that time? It wasn't, was it Harriet? Was it in Harriet or was it Aberdeen? It was in Harriet, yeah. So you had two places at the time. And so I fly up to Harriet, and we basically embarrassed the hell out of Tyson. And you know, what a mean and terrible corporation this is, you know, to actually lose a court case and then try to take a man's house. And I mean, it was, I mean, that's why we did the news conference, thanks to Bill. He organized the whole thing. And then they backed off. But Herman was willing to lose his house. That's the thing that's important about the founders of RCAF, is they're willing to die if they have to get competition back into our industry. Catastrophic results of losing. Look at this. And Michael K just talks about, you know, the producer share of the consumer beef dollar. And this is something none of the economists could ever argue with, so they always try to just divert from any conversation about it. But it's really the proof. It's really the proof. What is the producer share of the consumer beef dollar? Well, here's a chart right here. Look at it. I mean, 1995, we'd already lost about 15% from the 65% we were getting in 75. But then once that Pickett verdict came in, and boy, I mean, it really got hammered. But in addition to that, it was okay for the cattle producer to get 35% of the consumer dollar. It was okay during the COVID or during the pandemic for the cattle producer to get 27% of the consumer dollar, and consumers pay, you know, ridiculously price gouging prices. And for Tyson and the big packers to price gouge the big retailers and the food service companies. All this litigation's been swirling around in every single meat category, and no injunctive relief yet. And the other big problem we have is when we settle cases without injunctive relief, we've done no good. We've let them off the hook. They've still got the market power to extract that loss or that fine or whatever penalty they were assessed. They can still have the power to extract it right back out of the marketplace, just like the Batistas did when they got fined in Brazil for bribing the government officials and meat inspectors. You know, they just took it out of the Brazilian cattle market in the next few weeks, actually. So this is something that we make a huge mistake in, and it's something I worry about even with the RCAF litigation today. Are we going to settle this case and just let everything remain the same? Or are we going to have some changes? And this is where we really need to bring Congress in. And this is where we really need to connect to the consumer and to consumer groups, Patty Lavera, those Food and Water Watch, these kinds of groups that can really give us power on the Hill. How did we meet Marty Irby with the Organization for Competitive Markets? We met Marty Irby, who is one of the most effective lobbyists, particularly on the right, in Washington, D.C. We met him because we aligned with the Humane Society going after the beef checkoff. How do we kill this beef checkoff and the income of the NCBA who's got their foot on our neck? Litigation. We never got a settlement in that case. We never even finished the case before it all got quiet. But that's how we met Marty Irby, and he's doing us an amazing amount of good today through the Organization for Competitive Markets. So here we are in the current administration. We've got a very experienced Secretary of Agriculture, not in a good way. And so he was asked the question, we're putting a lot of money out. We've realized during the pandemic that we've got a real wreck on our hands. We can't feed ourselves. We don't have the infrastructure. It's fragile. It breaks very, very easily. During the pandemic, we had empty grocery store shelves all over the country. But those small, little, local, regional guys never ran out of meat. At Radge Foods Direct, our company, we never had an empty shelf. We just cranked it, and we worked a lot harder. We called up USDA, and I said, can we just have a little longer day? See, we're under inspection. Can we have an extended day and not have to pay for it? Can we get a longer day, maybe even by a couple hours, so that our guys can get an extra break in, perhaps, and we can get more produced? It took them about 5 minutes to respond, no. This is when the shelves are empty. No. Who do these guys, honestly, who do they work for? We know, don't we? We know exactly who they work for. And Vilsack pours all of this grant money into these local regional plants, which, by the way, now are failing right and left because they do not have market access. You can't just call up Walmart and sell all your meat, or Whole Foods and sell your meat at a profit. It's not going to happen. You can't get market access. It's wholesale market's over. So the one thing that the USDA can do as one of the largest meat buyers in the world is buy from the local regional plants. Think what we could do for the cow and bull market if we could just sell ground beef into the USDA system. Military, school, whatever. They buy a lot of it. And so the federal government won't stop buying food from meat packer tied to bribery case. And Vilsack was explaining, he said, or just to read it, in 2019, as Brazilian meat packer JBS was proving itself as a leading global criminal, instead of protecting American citizens by revoking JBS corporate charters and grants of inspection for its many, many criminal violations, our federal government funded JBS with lucrative preferential meat purchasing contracts. JBS is a big winner in USDA trade war relief contracts. Millions. We gave millions of dollars as they were taking money out of your ranches and feeding operations. And so Herman and I were just talking last night, and Kathleen a little bit, and you're going to get to hear from them a little bit later, but I was just reminded about how bipartisan RCAF agreed to be on day one. We work with both sides. We can't win if we don't. And we don't, and of course it's only gotten way worse over the years, the divide between the Democrats and the Republicans. And it's like a little sideshow. I think it was Shad and I were talking about, it's two wings on the same bird of prey. You know, we're being played. I mean, they honestly just respond to the money that's going in their pockets. And so here we are on K Street. This happens to be the day of Obama's inauguration. Of course, Herman, being a dear friend of Senator Daschle, we get an invite to their offices where they have this really cool layout of, you know, reception and so forth, and everybody's there. I mean, the lobbying firm, Alston & Berg, the law firm, is a really big lobbying outfit with a whole bunch of attorneys in it. And so here we are in this big room in a big circle, and we're talking just about stuff in general. And I said, you know what? We're on K Street. And what I would like to see happen on K Street is that we get rid of all these lobbying firms and turn K Street into low-income housing. And of course, that's when the bristling started. And then I said what we need to do is we need to turn the mall into a garden so they can eat. And they all just sort of leaned in. And it was fixing to be a mess. And Daschle stepped right forward into a couple steps into it, and he said, "Stop it, Mike is right." And so I'm glad Herman reminded me of this. Here we have Senator Dole, my senator from Kansas. We have Senator Daschle, who was an absolute key ingredient in RCAF. Senator Johnson was too. Stock growers, unbelievable organization. Why are we in South Dakota? It's the stock growers. It's South Dakota's. I mean, this is amazing what work the stock growers have done. But this is what we've got to get back to. We've got to bring these politicians back in again, and we've got to get way, way more aggressive in getting what we want. And the more pressure we apply, we said this years ago, the more resistance you face. But boy, are we there right now. I think we just need to keep pushing and holding them accountable. Thank you. Got time for questions? Comments? Good. Well, those lights are hard.
Right here.
Are you connected with Callicrate banders? Could we use some of those in DC?
You know, that was. Do you all remember Jeannie Charter from Billings, Montana? The original Chekhov protester, Jeannie Charter. Years ago, she says, "Hey, Mike, you know, we started the Callicrate Bander in 1991, so it was well before I met Bob Peterson." But Jeannie Charter just really, that was her original idea, is that should be used more broadly. Yeah. The problem is it's kind of a painless, you know, it's not quite stressful enough to suit me for that purpose. So, yeah, thank you for that. Oh. All right, well, thanks, everybody. All right.
Hold on, Mike.
No. So we need to take a break. So let's take a 10-minute break. Congresswoman Harriet, oh, wait a minute, there's a question.
Yeah, okay,
Here,
Frank.
I'm sorry.
Right here. Come on, Mike. Get
All right, Frank.
Every year, Farmers Union has a fly-in. Is there any way we could get together with them and have a fly-in together, or maybe get enough RCAF people to have a fly-in?
Boy, Frank, you know, we always do stuff with Farmers Union. I mean, they're our friends. I mean, as opposed to the Farm Bureau, and I think we've been pretty well participating in a lot of those because so many of our boards contain Farmers Union presidents and members and so forth. But man, I've been to Washington so many times. I just rather do the Patty LaVera thing, you know, and stay home and Zoom in. You know, I just, and you know, you're not supposed to say this because you're supposed to trust participatory government, but I have a hard time walking those halls of Congress and speaking with a staffer in the hallway who honestly doesn't care about being there, while the NCBA and Farm Bureau are in the members' conference room eating treats and drinking coffee and tea and talking to the member directly. This is just how I've felt in the many trips I've taken. And I know, but lately OCM has done a lot, they've done a lot more good. And so I think it's worth, Frank, you know, taking those trips to DC, but man, it's got to start working. We're losing too many operators. These farms are getting way too big, and Bill Gates is buying way too much land, and I don't want to be his farmer. So, thanks.
Thank you, Mike.